Welcome to CSIS. I'm Sujay Shivakumar, Senior Fellow and Director of the Renewing American Innovation Project here at CSIS. Securing the future of the semiconductor industry is vital to renewing American innovation. This is why I'm particularly delighted to welcome Professor Chris Miller, author of The Chip War. I'm equally pleased to welcome our interviewer, Professor Charles Wessner of Georgetown University, and a senior advisor to CSIS. He is also an expert on semiconductor policy. I will now turn to Dr. Wessner to more fully introduce and welcome our guest.
Good morning. I'm very pleased to introduce Chris Miller, who's an associate professor of international history, where his research focuses on technology, geopolitics, economics, international affairs, and Russia. In short, everything we think about on an international basis. Most importantly, he is author of The Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology, a geopolitical history of the computer chip and the current state of the industry and the international competition for it. He is also the Jeane Kirkpatrick Visiting Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the Eurasia Director at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Chris, welcome to CSIS.
Thank you for having me.
I think you should be congratulated on this outstanding work. Your book is a pleasure to read, it's easy to grasp, and at the same time, you address a wide variety of very complex policy issues. It's really a very refreshing read, and as we were saying, it couldn't be more timely. My first question is just a collegial one, being a Fletcher graduate myself, but what motivated you as a professor of international history at the Fletcher School and an expert on Russian and Soviet economic history to write a book about computer chips?
Well, I didn't actually start out intending to write a book about chips. I realized over the course of my research just how important semiconductors are. My initial question was about the evolution of military technology during the Cold War. And the puzzle that interests me is why was it that in the early Cold War, both the US and the Soviet Union could produce the key technologies, atomic weapons, long-range delivery systems, but by the end of the Cold War, the cutting edge of military technology was something that the US could do, but the Soviets couldn't. And you see this really visibly in the 1991 Persian Gulf War, where the US began to deploy precision strike capabilities that were far beyond what the Soviet Union could do itself. And I want to understand, well, why was this? Because the Soviet Union had a lot of capabilities that you might think would be core to developing technology, brilliant physicists, a lot of capital investment. But it became clear to me that the key transformative force in military power over the period of the Cold War was the application of computing to military systems. And to understand where computing power comes from, you've got to start with semiconductors. And it's the production of semiconductors, their design, and their proliferation throughout society that has explained not only the shifts in military power, but I also came to realize the broader economic and technological importance of chips. And I was someone who'd taken advantage of chips in my smartphones and PCs, but never really thought about how important they were. And over the course of my research, I realized that the really interesting question wasn't the shift in military technology per se, but rather how chips had transformed economy and society in ways that we were only really dimly aware of, even though we relied on them for all aspects of everyday life.
Well, that's great. I wish more people understood what you came to understand. You know, you've referred, and I think rightly, to some of the battles in the Reagan administration of computer chips, potato chips. You know, what's the difference? You treat that very, very effectively. In fact, why don't you make a quick reference? Why? What's the difference between potato chips and computer chips?
Well, one of the things that most people don't realize is that the process of designing and manufacturing chips is the most complex technological process humans have ever undertaken, bar none. The supply chain needed to produce an advanced chip stretches across multiple continents. It involves some of the most purified materials, some of the most precise machine tools ever made. So there's really nothing harder to produce than an advanced chip, which is why their production is both very difficult, but also very important when it comes to which companies and countries control that process. And that's why it's not simply a question of business or economics or technology, but also a question of really top-level political relevance as to which countries have these capabilities and which don't.
Well said. In fact, an add-on to, you mentioned the first Gulf War and the shock that many of our opponents had to see the deployment of these precision. But it's interesting, you can understand why the Soviet Union could not do that. Why would you think that the Putin regime, if we can call it that, still can't?
Well, if you look at the world today, most countries can't make advanced chips. In fact, the capability to make cutting-edge chips is really in the hands of just a couple of countries. And even many advanced economies don't have any capacity domestically to make an advanced semiconductor. So it's not just Russia or China that can't make advanced chips. Just a couple of companies can. And the reason is twofold. First off, there's just a ton of precision knowledge involved in producing semiconductors and the tools that are used to make them and the materials that can't be simply replicated. It's built up in companies over years, if not decades, and there's just no way to copy and paste that into a new organization. And secondly, it's brutally expensive.
Right.
An advanced chip-making facility is one of the most expensive factories in human history. And the amount of capital investment across the supply chain to make an advanced chip is extraordinary, which is why no country can go it alone, and most countries can't afford to get anywhere close to the cutting edge.
That's interesting, and I couldn't agree with you more. And yet there have been countries which started from basically nowhere and over time accreted knowledge. I think something that you point out very interestingly is not just the equipment, but the know-how that goes with that seems to be crucial. And yet Taiwan, under Morris Chang's leadership, and you must tell us at some point, how did you get in to see Morris Chang? There's a long line. But in any case, you talk about the Taiwanization of the chip industry, and that suggests a much more dynamic. There's countries that have been in the lead, and Japan comes to mind, and who are no longer. And America may be headed in that direction, although hopefully not. But what was the secret to the Taiwanization, and is that reversible over time?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize about Taiwan's role is that on the one hand, Taiwan is critically important. Taiwan produces 90% of the world's most advanced processor chips, and over 1/3 of the world's computing power that's added each year comes from chips made in Taiwan. So you can't imagine a world without Taiwan-made chips. But TSMC's success has been not by doing things on their own, but by embedding themselves very, very deeply in the international chip supply chain. So buying machine tools from the US and the Netherlands, buying materials and chemicals from leading Japanese firms, producing chips designed by companies largely in Silicon Valley. And so the Taiwan success story is not a success story about Taiwan going alone. It's a success story of integration of the best of Silicon Valley and the best of Taiwan. I think that's the first thing to put Taiwan's success in context. But secondly, TSMC deserves an extraordinary amount of credit for what they've done. A lot of this is the business vision of Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, who realized in the late 1980s that the industry was shifting to a model rather than integrating design and manufacturing in one company, of splitting design from manufacturing. And he was right to realize at the time that if he focused solely on manufacturing, he could eke out more efficiencies and grow to a much larger scale. And so today, TSMC, the company he founded, is the world's biggest chip maker. And in part because of that, it's also the world's most advanced, because they're able to hone their production processes over more and more chips. But TSMC is not a company that can do it alone. It's a company that works deeply with US tool makers, with US chip designers. And so it's part of this symbiosis between Silicon Valley and Taiwan that's made both more successful.
I think that's a very interesting term, symbiosis. What some people forget is that outstanding American companies like Qualcomm have had their success enabled by the capabilities. It's one thing to design it, but someone has to figure out how to manufacture it and manufacture it efficiently.
That's right.
With enormous capital requirements.
Well, and it's been a great enabler, too, of American design successes to not have to do the capital expenditure. Because you can't do a chip startup in the manufacturing business if a new factory costs $20 billion. No venture firm's going to give you $20 billion to start a new company. But if your only costs are hiring a number of chip designers, buying some software licenses, it's much more plausible to do startups there. So actually, Morris Chang and TSMC have enabled a startup ecosystem in California and in Texas and elsewhere in the US that previously didn't exist because they're able to provide manufacturing services that lower the cost of chip startups in the design space.
Well, we have the massively successful design firms like Qualcomm, perhaps to some degree NVIDIA, and AMD. I wonder have you seen a really vibrant ecosystem for new design firms that are coming on stream?
You do, and you see it in a couple different ways. Part of it is that you have new startups that are being created, especially around designing chips for artificial intelligence applications.
Right.
There's a lot of activity in that sphere. But next to that, the sort of small startups, you have big firms, big tech companies that are getting into the chip design business. So for example, Google and Amazon are designing their own chips, largely produced by companies like TSMC. And that's a big change in the industry, but it's important because if you're running a vast data center like Google or Amazon do, the more you can design your chips specifically around the processes you're running, the more efficient they can become. And so a lot of the design innovation is actually happening in big companies that are venturing into the chip design business for the first time.
Isn't it a lot more expensive for TSMC to manufacture what are, in essence, small batch designs?
There are certainly economies of scale for producing a lot more chips. But TSMC has lots of customers, some of which, like Apple, are producing millions and millions of chips for all the iPhones that are created, others that are much smaller. And so foundries like TSMC can produce for companies with smaller production runs too.
Well, you know, TSMC's success is quite remarkable. Do you see that as continuing with the top suppliers narrowing, or do you think we can at least maintain the current distribution with TSMC and Samsung, which are arguably national champions, and Intel, which we are reluctant to admit might be a national champion? But how do you see that working out over time? Is there any clear path?
Well, I think it's difficult to predict the future. Yes. And so I would be hesitant to make any confident predictions. And I would say that because 10 years ago, the pecking order in terms of technology was different. Intel had the most advanced process technology and TSMC was behind. So 10 years into the future, I don't know who's going to be ahead in that race. I think what we can say is that we're unlikely to see any or perhaps many new entrants into that market.
At the high end.
At the high end, that's right. The amount of knowledge that's very, very specialized is just too high, and the capital expenditure is too high for anyone else to get close.
Or indeed, as some European countries have learned for any country to do.
That's right.
It's just prohibitive. But it will be interesting. You've talked. Well, there are a number of things that's clearly related to China, but you've talked about Taiwan, or why don't you talk about Taiwan's and TSMC's importance to the Chinese economy, and where you have a very interesting chapter on some of the mutual dependencies there. Could you elaborate on that a little?
Well, TSMC produces chips that almost everyone in the world touches on a daily basis. Inside most smartphones, almost all smartphones, there's at least one, sometimes multiple TSMC-produced chips inside. Mm-hmm. Many PCs have TSMC-produced chips inside. Basically, every data center uses chips that TSMC produces, every cell phone tower, and that's not to include dishwashers and automobiles and microwaves. So you can't really go a day in the life of a typical American without touching dozens of TSMC products. Now, you never see them, and they don't say TSMC on them, but we're all deeply reliant on TSMC. And it's not just the United States, it's Europe, it's Japan, and it's China. And China is a country that is more dependent on TSMC than arguably any other, because it has no cutting-edge domestic capabilities, but it imports tons of chips because its economy is dependent on assembling electronics. Today, China spends as much money importing semiconductors as it spends importing oil, an extraordinary data point that changed the way I see the global economy. And the Chinese leadership realizes that this is a vulnerability. because their most advanced computing technologies are imported from Taiwan, from South Korea, from Japan, and from the United States, all geopolitical competitors or rivals. And so China's been trying to find ways to become less dependent on imported chips and less dependent on TSMC, and had some success, but also remains very reliant to this day.
Well, that's interesting. You say some success. They've had they had majors in 2010, and then they had the 2020 plan, and now the 2025 plan, and something is, given our Fletcher backgrounds, it's a little naive to say, but that China seems to be creating tensions and competing with countries that it's extremely dependent on, and I don't see where that leads them on the long term. Perhaps one of the most interesting things in the last 6 months is the Biden administration's decision to block access to top-end chips, and people often forget, but also the importance of equipment, manufacturing equipment from Applied Materials and KLA and Lam here. How do you see that playing out? The Peterson Institute has argued that they'll be able to make good in 3 or 4 years and circumvent these with domestic production. Based on what you've written, I would be interested to hear your views.
If you look at the controls that were put in place in October, they prevent the transfer of advanced chip-making tools from U.S. firms to China. There's discussions underway about also preventing the transfer of tools made in the Netherlands and Japan, which are 2 other leaders in this sphere, also to China. Right now, you can't make an advanced chip, or even a sort of second-generation most advanced chip, without using U.S. tools. And in terms of the tools that China produces domestically, they're far, far behind what U.S. or Japanese or Dutch firms can produce.
Let me interrupt you for a second. What do you mean by far behind? Sometimes I've seen national security documents or PCAST, the President's Advisory Committee on Science and Technology, who say that we have to keep them 2 generations back, which is 2 years or maybe 3, and that seems like a fairly narrow margin to me.
It's a complicated question because not every aspect of the chip industry moves along the same schedule.
Yes.
So when you talk about 1 or 2 generation, it's a pretty loose term actually. In logic chip making, the manufacture of processor chips, there's a fair amount of similarity between when firms talk about a given generation and the next generation. And because of the dynamics of Moore's law, which has predicted accurately that the computing power provided by a chip will double once every year or 2, between every generations, there's a big gap in computing power. And so 2 generations actually implies a pretty substantial differential in terms of what a chip can do. But as you say, it's not a huge differential, which is why the US has shifted its approach somewhat over the past couple of months. For a long time, the 2-generation gap was informal US government policy, but in a speech in September of last year, Jake Sullivan said he wants to grow the gap. So it's no longer going to be a sliding scale where if the US moves forward, export controls will advance to allow the transfer of older equipment to China. Now it's going to be a hard stop. The US is trying to move forward and not let China move forward, which will be harder to enforce. But also China's fairly weak position in tooling means that it, I think, is plausible, at least over the short, medium term.
Short to medium term meaning?
At least a number of years.
5 years perhaps?
I think at least. Because the trick in the chip industry is that the question isn't at what point will China reach 2023 levels of technology, because we're going to be far ahead of 2023 levels of technology. The question is when can China catch up to where we are in the future? And that's a really hard thing to do. And no country has ever caught up in the chip industry except by deeply integrating into international supply chains.
I think that's a very interesting point. Although some of our goals seem to be pushed together, to use a very technical term, but we seem to want to block them on artificial intelligence advances and perhaps in quantum. And as I understand it, the absence of access will be a major impediment for them. On the other hand, I'd be interested in your views. We kind of derisively refer to legacy chips, which is kind of funny because that's what runs everything. You know, our banking system, our airlines. In fact, we could probably use some more chips for the airlines based on what's been happening. But how do you see that playing out?
If you look at the cutting edge, and especially the cutting edge of the types of chips that are used in artificial intelligence systems, what you find is that all of the advances in AI over the past decade have come thanks to advances in chips. Mm-hmm. The key differential between AI's capabilities today and 10 years ago is not primarily that we have smarter computer scientists, it's that they have access to several orders of magnitude more transistors than they used to, and they can process a lot more data, train smarter algorithms. Because if you want to train an algorithm to recognize a cat versus a dog, you need to show it a lot of pictures of cats, a lot of pictures of dogs, and that's a lot of transistors that need to do that work for you. Advanced chips give you those additional transistors, give you that processing power, and let you teach systems to become smarter. And there's only a couple of companies that can design the types of chips that are used to train AI systems, and only a very small number of companies, TSMC being the most important, that can actually manufacture the chips involved. And China has no cutting-edge manufacturing capabilities, and only a small number of firms that are anywhere close on the design side. And so if they can't get access to the couple of types of high-end chips that are used to train AI systems, they won't be able to keep up in the AI race.
Well, there are kind of a series of interlocking questions from that. One is it's not clear to me, and I'd be interested to know what you think, that you do need the advanced chips for hypersonics, for hypersonic missiles and others, as I understand it. But a lot of the weapon systems can run on higher node chips, on what we call legacy chips. And there may be incentives for the Chinese to produce a great deal more of the legacy chips, although the question is, will we make the equipment available at that node? Do you have any idea where we'll go on that? Because if there is, representatives of ASML and others have argued that if we block them at the advanced chips, they may mass produce like Japan in the 80s and swamp global markets with something that you made clear in the book is if a company doesn't have to make a profit and goes only for market share, they're they're formidable competitors.
So I think, first off, on the relationship between the cutting edge in semiconductors and legacy nodes or lower tech nodes, if you think the cutting edge is really important, you also have to think legacy chips are more important, because the more advanced our computational capabilities become, the more benefit there is to have computation embedded across the edge of networks as well. And edge systems will sometimes have leading edge chips, but will also have a lot of lagging edge or legacy chips in them to undertake the activities they need to undertake. And so it's not that leading edge is becoming more important, it's that advances in the leading edge and advances in artificial intelligence that the leading edge enables makes it more useful to network more things together. And so we need both. And it's absolutely right that China's got the capability domestically to produce lagging edge chips. And we can talk about the specific definition of lagging edge. There's a lot of complexities in there. And it's also absolutely right that China's been investing primarily in building manufacturing capacity in the lagging edge. And I think the administration in the US and other countries have been right to focus on the leading edge first, because it really is a critical question when you're looking at chips used for AI. But it's also important to ask, where are we sourcing our lagging edge chips from, and are China's policies calling into question the profitability of companies in the US and Europe and Japan, and actually interestingly in Taiwan, which is in some ways the most exposed to Chinese competition at the lagging edge, simply because Taiwan produces a lot of lagging edge chips.
That's an interesting point. One requirement that we've heard and believe is probably accurate is for these export controls to be effective over time, we need the active support of our allies. I'd be interested how you see whether we'll be able to get the Japanese and particularly the Dutch support, because there are direct economic costs for doing that. At the same time, there's a question, and it's a real question, not a point of view, is the U.S. has the authority simply to block the exports because it's our equipment and our components, even for a company like ASML, that are critical. How do we really need allies, but underneath that, it seems to be that perhaps we don't.
Well, it's an interesting question, because it's true that as supply chains have gotten more and more complex, and as the number of components in advanced manufacturing equipment has gotten more complex, and just to give you one data point, inside of a ASML EUV lithography system, one of the key component systems is a laser produced by a German company called Trumpf, incredible company. And they have in their laser 457,000 component parts. So the likelihood that one of those components comes from the United States is very high.
Right.
And in any system that has 100,000 components, you're going to be sourcing some components from a wide number of countries. And so that gives the US and other countries more ability than ever before to insert political considerations into supply chains. But there are risks in doing that too much, because if a country develops a reputation of meddling in supply chains and of imposing export controls on used components, it also creates an incentive for companies in other countries not to put US components into their system. So there's a real balance to be struck. I think you're right that today the US has really extraordinary power over tech supply chains, because every tech system uses US components. But if we were to use all that power today, we would have a lot less of it in the future, because we'd create a really strong incentive for companies in Japan, Europe, and elsewhere to not use our components in their next generation systems.
Design them out.
Exactly.
Right. Well, we've heard that from some of the companies, and it's an understandable concern. At the same time, you can't design out ASML lithography, at least not and have anything remotely
That's right.
resembling. And if we keep the Japanese with us, they're as the French say, there don't seem to be 36 solutions, and of course our companies will continue to advance, so those parts will become. But there is this discussion of, are we really voluntaristic? Will we get a whole coalition with us? And there is a pretty large hammer under the desk, if I
think that's right, and I think my sense is that U.S. officials, and I think especially in Congress, are aware of the hammer under the desk, if you will. The other dynamic that's really interesting is if you're one of the countries we mentioned, you have a really strong incentive to hide behind the United States, because China might retaliate, and we've seen China retaliate against many of its trading partners. It does less so actually against the United States because of our size. Smaller countries are more at risk for retaliation. And B, domestically in other countries, politicians face costs when they take steps that hurt their firms.
Right.
And so there's a lot of incentive, even if political leaders in other countries are supportive or sympathetic of controls like this, to try to hide behind the U.S. and not take responsibility for them. And that's understandable. That's how political leaders operate.
Yes, no, it is. It is understandable. On a broader, from an economic historian point of view, it's interesting that we seem to have moved into a new phase of and the verb matters, of recognizing that we do industrial policy. Mm-hmm. You often hear debates, the dreaded words, we don't pick winners and losers. Often wondered what the Department of Agriculture does for the last 150 years. And the answer would be they picked a winner. And that type of long-term care, we seem to be coming back to that more. You may be familiar with Laura Tyson's great quote that in the chip industry, instead of the invisible hand of the market, there's the visible hand of governments. And in conversations with her, I remember hearing, I think it reflects what you were saying, that some countries don't want to provide the subsidies needed to attract and maintain corporations. And they don't have a semiconductor industry. Mm-hmm. It's just Australia and Canada come to mind in that regard. Do you think we're entering a new phase of more obvious, more declarative, and perhaps reinforced industrial policy?
I think in terms of the level of discussion of the term, certainly the answer is yes. In some ways, as you alluded to, there's always been a fair amount of government involvement in semiconductors for defense uses, for intelligence uses, for R&D funding via the National Science Foundation. Government's never been absent. I think what we're seeing now is that in the political leadership in Congress, in the White House, and elsewhere, there's a lot less concern about this term. But I think it needs to be approached carefully as well. because semiconductor supply chains are extraordinarily complicated.
Right.
Companies inevitably know more about how the supply chain works than government officials do. That's just an information asymmetry that's baked into the way the system works. And so government has to be very, very careful in the ways that it does try to intervene. And so I think if you look at tax policy is a great example of where other countries have had much more generous tax policy towards semiconductors. It's not rocket science as to why companies have invested more in other countries. It's cheaper to do so. That's a really easy place where the CHIPS Act has actually made a difference by strengthening tax incentives. But that's the type of policy where the government can pretty clearly identify what's the problem, what's the solution. The amount of information you need to devise a smart policy in that sphere is a lot less than if you were to try to undertake something more specific, more niche to the industry. And I think we do need to be very cognizant of the ways in which government is going to lag behind industry in terms of knowledge and in terms of its predictive capacity as to what the next technology and markets will look like. So there's a real tough balance to be struck here.
Right. I'm very happy to hear you say that, because that's basically the rationale for the Restoring American Innovation program here at CSIS. I used to work in the IT field, and the director would sometimes remark, well, as a last resort, we could ask the customer what he needs. And I think asking industry what they need and what are the consequences of what we're doing. But the the CHIPS Act you refer to is clearly a massive one, designed to address some of these imbalances in other countries' subsidies. There are two related things. One is one of the things that I worry about, having been in the government, is the one and done syndrome. We've passed a CHIPS Act, so we don't have to do any more. And my colleague, Dr. Shiva Kumar, has written that actually we're just starting. And another one I'd be interested to hear your views on is, we're all environmentalists these days, but we have a permitting problem in this country that I'd be interested to hear your views and how do you think that can be addressed?
I think the permitting question is absolutely critical. There's been great work on the amount of time and the number of hoops you need to jump through to build a chip making facility in the US versus in Korea or Taiwan, and what you find is that it's a lot harder in the US for land use, for environmental regulation, for getting access to the power and the water you need, which is substantial for chip making. It's a real challenge, and it's a challenge that can't solely be addressed at the federal level, because you have state and local governments adding layers of complication as well. So I think sensitizing political leaders to the challenges that chip firms face is important. Ultimately, it's hard for the US because, unlike Taiwan or South Korea, where chips are a critical part of the economy and everyone knows that TSMC's success or Samsung's success is critical for those two economies, in the US, we don't really think that way. Maybe we should, but we don't. And so getting political leaders to understand and treat the chip industry as a bit more important than they have in the past is going to be important in mobilizing political support to help push through improvements on the permitting front and help companies solve problems that they face when they're building new facilities.
Well, I think you're right there. I think part of the problem on the permitting is one of the things we like about this country. There's very diffused political power, and local entities have a lot to say. They can tie up for years a project, which, given the capital costs, essentially make it non-viable. Whereas I'm told, and it's probably not apocryphal, that you learned that there's going to be building in your neighborhood when the bulldozers arrive in China. So it's much more direct. But I think you raise a very important point there, that we don't, despite the potato chips analogy, we don't seem to recognize just how central this is to not only national security, but Dale Jorgensen at Harvard is now leftist, but he documented the massive productivity impact that not only chips have, but making chips have. And it's a question, why did Morris Chang decide to, if I can say that, put a TSMC fab in Arizona? And there's a strategic element to that question. There's manpower issues, which we should talk some more about. I don't know if you think there's a water issue there. It's, what's the there's those elements together? I'd be interested to hear.
Well, I think first off, why did TSMC decide to open a facility outside of Taiwan in the first place is an interesting question. They've had a couple of small facilities in China, lagging edge for some time. They already have had a very small facility and a very lagging edge in Washington State for some time. There was an investment made 20 years ago that has been really very small. But I think the company realized over the past 5 years that there is growing concern from other governments and from their customers about the security situation in the Taiwan Straits. And as a result, they're opening not only a facility in the US, but also in Japan and potentially down the road in Europe or maybe in Singapore as well. And they're going to be diversifying their production footprint somewhat. And that's something that they didn't want to do, but they've been pushed to do by governments and by customers. And if you look at their customers, Apple or Qualcomm or AMD or NVIDIA, these are all companies that are reading the same news headlines we are and wondering what international trade is going to look like in a couple of years and wondering about all of the goods that they rely on to be assembled in China, what the supply chains will look like. And every day there's a new headline about a new tech company reassessing their assembly or their manufacturing in China, and TSMC's customers are thinking through what that means for that company's manufacturing footprint. And I think that explains why the company has moved away from their history of being Taiwan-focused in production towards a much more distributed footprint. Now, why Arizona? Arizona is actually now one of the key centers of chip making in the US. So in terms of workforce, it's actually got one of the best developed workforces for the chip industry. In terms of water, perhaps not. That's something they'll have to deal with. They're building a water reclamation plant, actually, I think, precisely to address that issue.
Well, Arizona State University seems to be a major asset,
That's right.
And not least their flexibility. That's a university that can change things and respond. But you mentioned the geopolitical strains. You have a particularly interesting section on talking about Chinese interests in Taiwan and TSMC in Taiwan and why things may not be as bad as some scenarios suggest. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Is there a threat of invasion? And I might just add as a ringer, we often talk about the PLA. We don't talk about the earthquake gods.
That's right.
Perhaps you could elaborate on those 2 points. It would be, is there a danger of an invasion, and what would happen if they did?
Is there a danger of invasion? I think there's certainly a risk. What percentage chance should we put in that risk over the next, say, 10 years? We can debate the number. I think the number is higher today than it was 5 years back. And every military official or intelligence official in the US that testifies to Congress makes me think that the number is growing, not decreasing.
Yes.
And that's important because even if that number is small, 10 or 20%, if you multiply that number by the expected value of the cost of a war, it'd be trillions of dollars in disruption to global manufacturing. And so we ought to be willing to spend a lot of resources today as an insurance policy against the risk that something bad happens in the Taiwan Straits. Because if we were to lose access because of a blockade or a war to Taiwan-produced ships, we'd face a disruption in manufacturing akin, I think, to 1929 and the Great Depression.
Right. Auto
Manufacturing, dishwashers, household goods, consumer electronics, we face immense delays. I think the best example of this is in the last couple of years, we faced a semiconductor shortage in 2020, 2021. And those are 2 years when chip production globally increased.
Right.
Just demand grew faster.
That's a great point in your book, that it's not a supply chain problem. It was
a demand problem.
Yes. Right.
We wanted too many chips, which is a good problem to have for the chip industry. And they responded very effectively in some ways, increasing production by rapid rates. But imagine what the world would be like if rather than a double-digit rate of increase, but an even bigger demand increase, we had a 1/3 decline in the amount of processing power that was produced next year relative to expectation. It wouldn't just be smartphones or PCs. Think of cars. Cars have hundreds of chips inside of them today. Many of these chips are made in Taiwan. And as we found out over the last 2 years, if your car has 99% but not the final chip it needs, it can't drive away.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things I thought was the most disturbing in your analysis was not the invasion, as you referred to it, not a D-Day invasion, but just a blockade, or sufficient threats of a blockade to break the confidence that is necessary. Do you think that that's a more likely possibility? And how would that work?
Well, we know that after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan last summer, the exercises that the PLA undertook were to simulate what you need to do to begin a blockade. And in some ways, a blockade is an interesting tactic for China to try. They wouldn't call it a blockade, they'd call it a quarantine, just like we did to Cuba in the 1960s. And it's tricky because the Soviet Union lost the Cuban Missile Crisis because they were far away, and the US had far more forces to bring to bear against Cuba from the southern United States. It would be a very challenging dilemma for the US politically, economically, as well as militarily. How would it play out? It's been war gamed thousands of times with different results. The answer is we don't know, but that makes me nervous.
Yes, that intermediate state makes me very nervous as well. It's the Chinese curse. You live in exciting times. So it's. Do you think we have, just to close here? Do you think we have the manpower that we need to? I'm interested to hear what you say about Arizona, but do you think we have a talent pipeline? And a related, it's a difficult question, but some argue that if we don't import high-end talent from places like India, we just can't do this. We talk about educating young women and getting them interested at the age of 12, but they won't have a PhD for another 15 years, if not longer. So,
well, I think that in terms of importing talent, it's really been key to Silicon Valley's success since the earliest days. If you look at Fairchild Semiconductor, one of the two companies that invented the first integrated circuits, 2 of the 8 founders were not born in the United States. And you can go through the chip industry and find dozens and dozens of Americans who were immigrants to the country, Morris Chang being the best example. Unfortunately, he immigrated again. That was a big problem we faced. So immigration is going to be key to the solution. But I think in terms of thinking about manpower problems, on the one hand, industry is always saying we need better trained workforce. And that's always true. You always want a better trained workforce. I'm skeptical of the thesis that it's going to be a sufficiently large roadblock to really prevent the US from doing what it needs to do in the chip industry. If you look at US universities, they're training not only the next generation of chip making experts in the US, but also globally. It's still the case that in Taiwan and Korea, they're sending many of their best students to US universities to study. And so I don't see a reason why this isn't a solvable problem, even though
sadly, we send them back.
Well, that's right. And that's certainly a problem. But I think the workforce question is a question that's solvable. It's going to require some thinking about companies in terms of what are their training programs, some universities, in terms of how do you train people specifically to work in industry, and also I think government in connecting universities with companies in more effective ways.
And just in closing, what do you think is the biggest challenge to the CHIPS Act being successful? And how would you, the classic question, how would you measure success?
Well, that's the hard question, I think. In some ways, I think the easy part of the CHIPS Act is the manufacturing incentives. Because companies know how to create chip-making facilities. And so if we incentivize them to do so, we're going to get more chip-making facilities in the US. I think that's pretty straightforward math. I think the hard part of the CHIPS Act is the R&D effort. And a quarter of the funds are dedicated to R&D. And that's trickier, harder to measure, but also harder to do successfully. But it's, I think, more important. I think in 10 years' time, when we look back on the CHIPS Act, we're going to assess its success or failure not on whether we slightly increased the share of manufacturing that happens in the US, but whether we kept Moore's Law alive. And I don't think nearly enough people, I wake up in the morning, every morning thinking, this can be the day when we find out that Moore's Law is finally dead. And if so, society is going to change dramatically, economic growth is going to slow dramatically. And I don't think we're nearly afraid of that to the extent that we ought to be.
Good point.
And so I wish political leaders would think more about that question and then put the R&D infrastructure in place that would solve that problem over the longer run. Because we've got a line of sight over the next couple of years to keep shrinking transistors, but beyond a couple of years, it's harder to say. And I don't think we're ready for the consequences of a world in which Moore's Law does come to an end.
Well, you did raise some very optimistic predictions at the end of your book. But I remember asking Gordon Moore personally about Moore's Law, and I pointed out that a lot of people were predicting that it was about to come to an end. This was in the early 2000s. And he said it may be, but they have been predicting that for the last 40 years.
That's right.
So there may be some help there. But thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us here at CSIS, and look forward to seeing you here again. These questions that we've touched on today are, as you suggest, are not going away. And the devil's always in the detail. So I look forward to working with you in the future.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.